Years ago, I created a video that was all about prepping the surface of a canvas for your artwork. And what I mean by that is a lot of what I do is automotive related. So I'm very used to working on a very smooth, hard surface most of the time. And even when I'm painting other things, I still really prefer a nice smooth surface as opposed to the texture that is usually present on a canvas. So in the previous video, I discussed a couple different manual ways that you can add gesso to the surface, either with a paintbrush or with a spreading tool. And then between coats, once that's dry, you can come in with sandpaper and really start sanding that away. And then you apply more coats as needed. This canvas is already pretty close to being ready for artwork. It's already had several coats of gesso applied that were sanded in between, and now the texture is pretty much gone, but it still needs one, maybe two more coats of gesso just to fill the sand scratches and get it finally ready for artwork. In the previous video, I talked about the fact that I generally prefer to spray gesso on a canvas as opposed to manually spreading it with a paintbrush or a spreading tool, because when you're using the manual methods, you're leaving little highs and lows all over the place. It takes a lot more time, a lot more work to go in and sand all of that out to get it really nice and smooth and even. When you're spraying the gesso with a spray gun over your surface, it's a pretty even coat all the time. So it takes a lot of the work out of it. I got several questions after I posted that video about how I go about spraying the gesso on my canvas. So in this video, that's what I'm going to show you. The first thing is we need to mix up our gesso. Gesso comes in some different forms. This one here, it's obviously a liquid form, but it's a lot thicker. This is what I prefer to use if I'm going to spread it with a spreader or a paintbrush. This one is a lot more liquidy. This works much better for a spray gun. Obviously, you will need a spray gun if this is the method that you're going to use, as well as an air source capable of running the gun. This is an LPH 440. It's an Iwata gun with a 1.4 millimeter tip and nozzle, which will be good for the finish coat. So once I've got the gesso out, I need to pour it into a paint cup. Hopefully this is going to be enough. And with a stir stick, you can see just how thick this actually is. It's barely dripping off of the stick. That's too thick to spray through the gun. So when it comes to reducing the gesso, you can use water. I've found that the Createx reducers work really well also, because this is an acrylic gesso and these reducers are made for acrylic paints. Now, this is something I discussed in a previous video as well, talking about the different reducers. I'm using a mix. It's a cocktail between the 4020 and the 4011 reducer. This is actually 3 parts 4011 and 1 part 4020 reducer. That just gives it a little bit more of a kick to allow it to dry a little bit faster in the humid conditions where I'm at. So I just I pour a little bit of reducer into the cup, and with this consistency of this particular gesso, it's roughly about the same as mixing like an auto-borne reducer. That's still a little bit too thick. What I'm looking for is for it to just kind of pour off of the stir stick in a nice continuous stream. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the reducer. That's closer to what I want. See how it's just flowing off of there? So make sure this is stirred very well, and the same 10 to 15 minute rule applies when you're mixing this reducer into your gesso. I want to let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes to really acclimate and become one product, because it will spray better. So I'll give that the 10 to 15 minutes to sit, and I'll go set up the shop in order to spray the gesso. All right, it's been about 10 minutes now. I've got everything in the shop set up. So now I just need to pour this mixture into my D-cup for the spray gun. Ordinarily, it's never a bad idea to strain your paint. I'm not going to worry about it with the gesso. I can always lightly sand any little nibs out of it if needed. It usually flows on pretty smooth. Trying not to make a mess. And for the most part, I did all right. Attach the lid. And now we're ready to spray. This is probably still a little bit thick. But at the end of the day, what you're shooting for is a good, even coverage. Overlapping about 50%. You have to spray a little bit slower when you're spraying a thick material like this. So we'll give this time to dry, and then we'll come back and do another coat. Like I said, that was still just a little bit thicker than I would really like. So I think for the next coat, and which should be the last coat, I'm going to add just a little bit more reducer into this. And what I can do is actually just pour it straight through the hole. Just to give it the opportunity to flow out a little bit better. I can kind of shake that around a little bit to get that reducer mixed into the mix, and it's going to have to sit for probably a good 10, maybe 15 minutes for that first coat to dry anyhow. So the way that you know when you're ready for another coat is when the sheen is gone. It should be a flat, dull white surface. I can still see a little bit of a sheen right in this area. I'm not sure if the camera's picking that up or not, so it needs a little bit more time to dry, and then we'll be ready for what should be the last coat. I think we're about there. There's a slight little sliver I see over there that should probably be dry by the time I get to that point. So I'll grab the gun, my respirator, and we'll spray this next coat. Here we go. See, my speed is very consistent. Again, trying to overlap about 50% on each pass. Take your time. That looks pretty good. And there you go. After about 15, maybe 20 minutes, this is now dry. It's a very smooth, nice surface ready for paint. In cases where I plan to use subtractive techniques, whether it's erasing or scratching techniques, things of that nature, I will normally come in and spray 2 or 3 coats of an auto-borne sealer over the gesso, because the auto-borne sealer is a little more durable compared to gesso in my opinion. In cases where I plan to use paint only, no subtractive techniques, then I will start painting directly over the gessoed surface. Obviously, I had already done some work to this canvas before I actually began filming. If you're starting with a fresh canvas, you're going to need to spray a thicker consistency of the gesso in order to begin filling in that texture. How many coats does it take? It varies depending on the canvas. I've found that different manufacturers have different textures. Some are smoother than others. I would also recommend a much larger needle and nozzle set. I use the same gun I was using in this demonstration, but when I'm starting and trying to fill in the texture initially, I use a 2.5 millimeter needle and nozzle in the same Iwata LPH 440. The trick behind this is once you start putting your gesso, spraying your gesso onto the surface, is getting the consistency right. You want it thick enough that it's going to fall down in those voids and fill the little valleys of the texture, but you also want it to be able to flow out and smooth out on the surface. If you spray several coats, and generally speaking, I would say it takes anywhere from 5 to 6 to maybe 7 coats to really get it pretty smooth. If you get the consistency wrong and the gesso can't flow out once it's been sprayed, then you're just kind of stippling the surface. So you're actually filling the texture, but you're creating texture as well, because the gesso on the higher surfaces of the texture isn't flowing out and leveling back out. It's staying in place. So you're filling the texture, but you're also creating texture, which means you're going to have to come in with some sandpaper and sand the entire canvas out to get it smooth. If you do this correctly and you get the consistency right where the gesso flows out, there's very little sanding involved. Before I put the last 2 coats on this canvas, I lightly came over it with some 320 just to knock off any little high areas or nibs, just to make sure it was good and level. It doesn't take very long at all. So again, if you get all of this right, it requires a lot less work to get a really nice finish on your canvas. So I hope all of that makes sense. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you have questions, leave them in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I will see you then.